It started like any other weekend morning, quiet, calm, the sun just beginning to spill over the rooftops. I was sipping coffee, enjoying the stillness, until I noticed an unusual amount of movement through my front window. At first, I assumed it was just neighbors going about their day. But when I stepped outside, what I saw made my stomach drop. Trucks were pulling into my driveway. People were unloading floral arrangements, audio equipment, tables, and chairs. A massive white tent was already halfway set up on my front lawn. Strangers in matching shirts moved with rehearsed efficiency, as if this chaos had been planned for weeks. And it had, just not by me. At first, I was too stunned to speak. I kept scanning for some kind of logical explanation. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the crew had the wrong address. But then I noticed the HOA president herself standing by the truck, clipboard in hand, giving directions like she was the event planner of the year. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. I approached her, demanding an explanation. She smiled, almost too casually, and said, "Oh, we thought this would be the perfect place for the community wedding. Your yard is so open and picturesque. It just made sense." I was floored. There was no letter, no email, no request, no warning. Nothing. They had decided, without consulting me, to host a full-scale wedding on my private property. She acted like she was doing me a favor, like I should be honored. I asked her if she had any kind of approval, legal or otherwise, to use my land. She simply shrugged. "We're the HOA," she said, as if that gave her divine authority over everything inside the neighborhood gates. I wasn't just angry, I was insulted. The sheer audacity of using my house as a venue, completely without consent, was beyond comprehension. These weren't a few kids cutting through my lawn. This was an organized event. Guests, permits, caterers, music, seating charts, and all. I stepped back inside and checked my security cameras. That's when I realized just how far it had already gone. Trucks had started arriving as early as 5 a.m. The HOA had clearly instructed them to set up quietly. They knew I wouldn't approve, and they wanted everything in place before I noticed. It wasn't just disrespect, it was calculated. They banked on me being passive. They counted on me backing down. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I began reviewing the HOA bylaws, searching for any justification they might try to twist in their favor. Nothing. Not a single clause gave them the right to commandeer private property for community use, especially for something as significant and disruptive as a wedding. I called the county office and confirmed what I already suspected. No event permits had been pulled from my address. That meant no inspections, no traffic planning, no noise compliance. In other words, not only was this immoral, it was also illegal. By mid-morning, guests were beginning to arrive. Dressed in suits and gowns, they strolled up my driveway like they belonged there. My mailbox had even been draped in wedding ribbons. I overheard people commenting on how generous I was to offer up my home for the ceremony. Generous? I was livid. I hadn't offered anything. I hadn't even been asked. The sense of entitlement was staggering. They assumed I'd just go along with it, that I'd stay quiet in the background while strangers drank champagne on my porch, that I'd play host to a celebration I had nothing to do with. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just a boundary being crossed. It was a message. The HOA was trying to assert control, not just over my property, but over me. And that's when the idea struck. I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to plead for them to take their tents and leave. No, I was going to show them, in the most permanent way possible, that they had picked the wrong house. When a homeowners association begins to believe it has unchecked authority, it's only a matter of time before boundaries become blurred, and that's exactly what happened here. What was once intended to be a cooperative body meant to uphold community standards had morphed into something entirely different, something intrusive, controlling, and, in this case, outright illegal. They didn't just overstep, they stomped all over my rights as a property owner. And they did it with a sense of confidence that was as baffling as it was infuriating. The HOA had long been known for its overly involved behavior, sending warnings for minor lawn imperfections, fining residents for leaving trash cans out for more than a few hours, even measuring the height of fencing panels. Still, Most of us tolerated it, assuming there were limits to their control. That assumption shattered the day I found out they scheduled a wedding event at my home without so much as a knock on the door. There was no formal communication, no attempt to request permission, no legally binding agreement. They simply decided that my property was the ideal location for their community event and proceeded as though it was their own. This wasn't a matter of confusion or administrative oversight. It was a deliberate, coordinated move that completely ignored the legal framework of property rights. The fact that they thought they could orchestrate this without any accountability reveals just how far removed from reality the HOA board had become. They had hired vendors, coordinated deliveries, printed invitations, and scheduled rehearsals, all while bypassing the fundamental principle that no one, not even an HOA, can use someone else's private land without permission. Their justification? Community interest. Their tone suggested that if something benefited the HOA as a whole, individual rights could be brushed aside. But the law doesn't work like that. Community benefit does not override individual ownership. As I looked into the legalities, it became clear just how many rules they had broken. They had no rental contract or venue agreement because I never signed one. They had not obtained an event permit from a city, which is required for any gathering of that size. They had no liability waivers, no insurance coverage for the property, and no emergency plans. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was a complete legal disaster waiting to happen. If someone had gotten hurt, guess who would have been liable? Me, the actual homeowner. The person who wasn't even invited to his own front yard. What was even more maddening was how calmly they tried to spin the situation. When I confronted the HOA president, she talked about how the couple getting married had always dreamed of a lakeside ceremony, and how the whole board voted in favor of using my property. It was like she truly believed that a vote among board members gave them the legal right to seize private space for public use. She spoke as if the act of choosing my yard somehow created permission out of thin air. Their approach reflected a dangerous misunderstanding of their own power. HOA boards are not governments. They do not have eminent domain. They cannot assign or requisition property. They are administrative bodies with specific, limited authority, and that authority ends at the edge of your deed. The moment they made decisions about my land without including me, they weren't just violating social norms, they were crossing legal lines. This wasn't a case of confusion. This was entitlement masquerading as community service. It was a power play wrapped in polite language and floral centerpieces. And it was done with such audacity that I began to wonder how many other homeowners had fallen victim to similar schemes, too afraid or unaware to push back. It felt like I had become an unwilling participant in a show where everyone had rehearsed their lines except me. And the worst part? They expected gratitude. They assumed I'd roll with it, that I'd play along because it was just one day. But it wasn't just one day. It was a precedent, a dangerous one where property owners are told their consent doesn't matter if a committee decides otherwise. One where private spaces can be converted into community assets through peer pressure and procedural manipulation. And once that line is crossed, it becomes harder to draw it again. I was out of town for a couple of days, visiting family and taking a much-needed break from the chaos of work. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend, completely off the grid, no distractions. I had no reason to check my phone constantly, no urgent emails waiting. But late Saturday night, I received a motion alert from my home security system. I almost ignored it. It was probably just a raccoon or a passing car triggering the camera. Still, something told me to take a look. What I saw made my heart sink. There were trucks, not one or two, but a whole convoy of them pulling into my driveway. Men in uniforms were unloading equipment, tables, chairs, lighting rigs, flower stands, and what looked like an altar. At first, I thought it was a break-in or maybe a strange kind of party gone wrong. But then I recognized a few faces. People from the neighborhood, even the HOA president herself, standing confidently at the center of it all, waving her arms and directing people like she was managing a concert setup. I stared at the footage, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I rewound the clips and watched them all the way from the beginning. The entire thing had started around dawn. A A team of workers arrived and began setting up a large canopy across my front yard. Then came tables, floral arrangements, white folding chairs. Someone even wheeled in a chocolate fountain. By early afternoon, my yard had been fully transformed into what looked like a wedding venue, without my knowledge, without my permission, without a single word of communication. My initial reaction was disbelief. I kept thinking maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe they thought they were the wrong house. But the longer I watched the footage, the clearer it became that this was intentional. The workers didn't hesitate. They moved like they had rehearsed this before. The HOA president was confidently walking through my property, making calls, and smiling like everything was going exactly to plan. The most surreal part was seeing strangers walk across my porch as if it belonged to them. Some of them were sipping drinks, laughing, inspecting the setup. They were comfortable, casual, completely unaware that they were trespassing, completely unaware that the owner of the home had no idea any of this was happening. And the security footage didn't lie. I saw them place reserved signs with names on chairs, stack wedding gifts under the shade of my oak tree, and even tie balloons to my fence. All of this was being done like it was the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't believe how far it had gone without anyone thinking to contact me. No one thought, hey, maybe we should check with the person who owns this house. No one thought it might be worth confirming if the homeowner was okay with 100-plus guests walking through his yard. Instead, they simply assumed. They assumed that since I wasn't home, they had a green light. They assumed they wouldn't be caught, or worse, they assumed I wouldn't care. But the cameras captured everything. Every truck, every vendor, every guest that walked up the driveway was recorded. Every conversation at the edge of the garden. Every nod of approval from the HOA president. Even the moment when the groom and his best man walked out to test the aisle. The entire operation had been caught on tape. And as I watched it unfold from hundreds of miles away, I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. There had been no attempt to contact me beforehand. No email. No call. Nothing. I scrolled through my inbox, double-checked voicemails, radio silence. They had planned this behind my back, and they had executed it under the assumption that I wouldn't find out until it was too late to stop it. That's what made it worse. Not just the event itself, but the fact that it had all been designed to happen before I could react. It wasn't just an invasion of privacy. It was a violation of trust, of legal boundaries, of basic decency. And it had all been laid bare in crisp HD footage, recorded moment by moment as my property was turned into a venue I never agreed to host. The first thing I noticed when I got back home was the state of my yard. It looked like a battlefield after a festival. Flattened grass, crushed flower beds, plastic cups tossed in the bushes, and ribbons still flapping from the fence. Someone had dragged a table across the driveway, leaving long gouges in the pavement. The trash bins were overflowing with empty wine bottles, crumpled napkins, and leftover food. It didn't look like my home anymore. It looked like a rented party venue that no one cared about cleaning up. And the kicker? No one from the HOA had contacted me, followed up, or even left a note. I walked through the property in disbelief. Everything about it screamed disrespect. The decorative lights were still dangling from my gutters. A few chairs were left scattered on the back lawn. There were even wet footprints across my deck leading to the back door, which someone had clearly tried to open. They used my home, my land, my space without permission, and they didn't just stop there. They treated it like it was theirs, like they were entitled to it, like my voice, my rights, and my consent didn't matter. I called the HOA immediately. When I finally got the president on the phone, her tone was cool and dismissive. "It was a beautiful event," she said. "Everyone was so grateful you let us use your space. We made sure to be respectful." I nearly dropped the phone. She spoke like this had been a mutual agreement, like I had donated my home for a charitable cause. I reminded her that I never agreed to anything, never received a message, never gave approval. She paused, then said, "We didn't think you'd mind. You're rarely home on weekends." That one sentence was enough to boil every ounce of patience I had left. So because I wasn't physically there, I didn't deserve a choice. Because I chose to live quietly and mind my business, that meant they could make decisions on my behalf. The more I listened to her talk, the clearer it became. They didn't see me as a person with rights. They saw me as a checkbox, a plot of land on a map, a passive bystander in their little community theater production. And they believed their position on the HOA board gave them the moral and legal high ground to decide what could happen on my property. I started looking through the community guidelines. I pulled up the HOA bylaws, the homeowner agreement, even the land use clauses buried in the fine print. Nowhere, and I mean nowhere, did it say that the HOA could use a resident's property for community events without explicit written permission. They had no signed waiver, no usage form, no agreement whatsoever. Their justification rested solely on the assumption that they were acting in the neighborhood's interest. But interest isn't the same as authority. There's a line between serving the community and exploiting it. They didn't just cross that line, they erased it. I reached out to a property attorney to confirm what I already knew. He was stunned. "This is a clear violation of property rights," he said. "No HOA can bypass an owner's consent for something like this. It's not just unethical, it's illegal." We documented everything. The security footage, the photos of the aftermath, the HOA emails, and lack of any communication. I even managed to get some statements from neighbors who were invited to the wedding and had been told, falsely, that I had graciously offered my space. The HOA had spread the narrative that I was involved, that I was part of the plan. They used my silence as permission. They used my absence as approval. That's not just a misstep. That's a calculated effort to rewrite the truth. I realized they didn't see what they were doing as wrong. They thought that if it looked good, felt good, and served their agenda, the details didn't matter. The event was a success. The bride was happy. The photos were beautiful. And in their minds, that justified everything. They leaned on the idea of community spirit. That old line about doing things for the good of the neighborhood. But real community doesn't come at the expense of someone else's rights. Real community asks first. It respects boundaries. It doesn't turn your backyard into a venue and then tell you to be grateful. It doesn't equate silence with consent. It doesn't ignore ownership just because it's inconvenient. When it became clear that the HOA had no intention of acknowledging their wrongdoing, I knew I had to take action. They had taken my silence as compliance, my absence as permission, and my property as their playground. After days of frustration and disbelief, I realized that trying to reason with people who refused to respect boundaries wasn't going to fix anything. They didn't need another polite conversation or a stern warning. They needed a wake-up call that couldn't be ignored. Something permanent, something bold, something that would ensure they never made the same mistake again. At first, I considered going through the usual legal channels. I spoke to my attorney, who confirmed I had a solid case for trespassing, property damage, and unauthorized use of private land. We discussed options, from formal cease and desist letters to pursuing civil litigation. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized legal action alone wasn't enough. A lawsuit would take months, maybe years, and even if I won, what would stop them from trying something just as outrageous in the future? Fines come and go. Apologies fade. I needed to make a statement that would stand as a lasting symbol of boundary, ownership, and accountability. That's when I remembered something I had quietly filed with the county months earlier, an approved demolition permit. The old structure on the back half of my property had long been an eyesore. It used to be a shed, then it was a garden house, then it just sat there, unused and taking up space. I had filed the paperwork out of caution, thinking I'd eventually tear it down and maybe rebuild something more useful. But now, that permit had a different purpose. It wasn't just about clearing space. It was about sending a message. I called the demolition company that Monday morning. I told them I was ready to move forward with the project. We scheduled the work for later that week. The crew was more than happy to take it on. Fast job, clean removal, and all the paperwork already approved. I stood there, watching as the first hammer fell, and something in me shifted. I wasn't just reclaiming a patch of land. I was reclaiming control. I was reminding everyone that this wasn't shared space. It wasn't public property. This was mine. The demolition wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. It was targeted. The very area where the wedding had taken place, the area they had so confidently decorated, where they had driven stakes into the soil and laid out carpets, was now being ripped apart piece by piece. The gazebo they had set up without asking, the chairs they had lined up without consent, the altar they had assembled like they owned the place, all gone. The workers didn't just tear down the old shed. They cleared the entire area, including every leftover trace of the event. Neighbors started to notice. Some stopped to watch. A few even asked what was happening. I told them the truth, calmly, directly, and without any drama. The HOA used my yard for a wedding without permission. I'm making sure they never do it again. Most of them nodded, wide-eyed, and backed away slowly. They understood. Word spread quickly. Within a day, the HOA president sent me a message. Not an apology, just a question. Was the demolition necessary? I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The sound of jackhammers did all the talking. The crew worked fast. By the end of the week, the area was unrecognizable. Clean, leveled, and empty. Where they had seen a perfect event space, I had drawn a hard line. No more parties. No more events. No more assuming. If they wanted to know who owned this land, they now had a very clear answer. It wasn't about revenge. It was about respect. The kind of respect they had failed to give when they walked onto my property without asking. The kind of respect they only seemed to understand when it hit them in a way they couldn't ignore. I didn't ask for this conflict. I didn't pick this fight. But once it was brought to my doorstep, literally, I made sure I ended it on my terms. Not with yelling, not with threats, but with action that couldn't be undone. Action that left no room for interpretation. The HOA thought they could bulldoze over my rights with smiles and flower arrangements. So I responded in kind, by showing them what a real bulldozer looks like. Power is a funny thing when it's placed in the hands of people who were never meant to wield it. That's exactly what happened with this HOA. Somewhere along the way, they stopped thinking of themselves as facilitators of the community and started acting like rulers of a private kingdom. They weren't enforcing guidelines or encouraging harmony anymore. They were making executive decisions with no input, no consent, and no consequences. And when they decided to schedule a wedding at my house, on my land, without my permission, it was the ultimate expression of that unchecked arrogance. The idea that they could take over my property, use it as an event venue, invite guests, vendors, and performers, all without notifying or asking me, wasn't just disrespectful. It was a full-blown declaration that they believed my ownership didn't matter, that my rights were a formality they could work around. They didn't even try to cover it up. There was no forged document or shady backdoor approval. They simply acted with full confidence, like they were untouchable. And that belief, that illusion of power, had been growing unchecked for years. HOA meetings had long since stopped being about community needs. They had become echo chambers where a small handful of board members patted themselves on the back while enforcing arbitrary rules. You couldn't park too close to the curb. You couldn't hang certain types of blinds. You couldn't paint your door anything other than one of 5 approved colors. It was always about control. But up until now, the things they controlled were annoyances, petty, overreaching, but manageable. This was different. This was personal. This was a line they had no business crossing. When they turned my property into a wedding venue, they didn't just disregard my ownership. They rewrote the rules entirely. They believed they had the authority to do it because no one had ever told them otherwise. They interpreted silence as weakness. They saw no consequences in sight, and they acted accordingly. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't going to roll over. I wasn't going to write a strongly worded letter and wait 6 weeks for a reply. I had seen what happened when people let these kind of power trips go unchallenged, and I wasn't about to be another example of someone who let it slide. They wanted to turn my yard into a symbol of their community leadership. I turned it into a symbol of what happens when you forget who really owns what. They thought this would be a feel-good story they could boast about at the next meeting. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. Because while they were busy acting like they ran the neighborhood, they forgot the one thing that actually gives them any authority at all: respect. Without that, their rules, their titles, their little votes in the clubhouse mean nothing. I didn't need to shout or argue or storm into their office. I didn't need to show up to their meetings with signs and petitions. I just needed to remind them that their power stops where my property line begins. that HOA rules don't override the law. That good intentions, or at least the illusion of them, don't excuse trespassing, deception, or misuse of someone else's land. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back to business as usual. There's no pretending it didn't happen. There's no rewriting the story. They tried to control the narrative. They told neighbors that I had agreed, that I was just being difficult after the fact, that I had misunderstood. But you can't twist video evidence. You can't argue against timestamps and permits and footage of your board members walking across my lawn with clipboards and headsets. They were caught, not just in action, but in the belief that they could do anything they wanted as long as they smiled while doing it. That belief was shattered the moment I fought back. It's easy to feel powerless when dealing with people in positions of neighborhood authority. They often rely on that feeling, expect it, count on it. But power only works when people give it their consent, when they believe it's legitimate. And when that power is abused, the only proper response is to strip it down to its roots and expose it for what it really is: a performance, a game, a fragile illusion that falls apart the second someone refuses to play along.